This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On February the 27th, our Defence and Security Studies program hosted Harrison Lowman, managing editor of the Hub, who asked whether Canada has lost its place on the world stage.
Fire when ready, Grizzly.
Coming in. Okay, so we'll get started. Good evening. So I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the director of the Defence and Security Studies program here at the Royal Canadian Military Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to our expert speaker series. Harrison, make note of that. For February of 2024, although it feels something like spring or almost summer today. We're pleased to have Harrison with us tonight. I apologize for the sort of constricted space that we're in. We're a victim of his success because we would have been in the medals room, which has a capacity of about 30 people in comfortable settings. But having exceeded that, we needed to find another place. And fortunately for the RCMI, but unfortunately for us, the Otter Room, which is the largest space in the facility, was not available. It's having some other thing to do with, I think, Scotch. I may be going to check that out just to confirm that. No, I won't do that.
These rumors are true.
Rumors are true.
Combine the two rooms.
Well, I had thought of that actually, but no, it didn't work out that way. But no, that's great. We're pleased to have Harrison with us tonight. Quick, non-scientific survey. How many people here tonight are not members of the RCMI? Oh, goody.
You're a member.
No, I demonstrated to them because that's the way it works, right? So you might consider membership in the RCMI. I'm not here to push that. That's not my job. But I think that we'll try to see if we can get some packages together in the long bar after this event is over, because I think it's important that we do that. For how many people is this the very first time you've been to the RCMI? Oh, good. This is good stuff. I'm not going to bore you for any length of time with the fact that this location has been here since 1890. President Clary, I believe.
We had another location
First.
Then we moved here.
But 1890, and of course this was obviously rebuilt. It wouldn't have looked like this in 1890, but for those of you, this is for your first experience, I hope that you enjoy yourself tonight. But let's get down to business. So Harrison was introduced to me through our colleague, Director of Communications, Eric Morse, and you've seen the wonderful picture and flyer related to this event. The important thing is that Harrison right now is the new managing editor of the Hub. And I started looking at the Hub a while ago. I found the writing very well done and very interesting and very relevant. And then when I found out that Harrison had become the managing editor, I got even more interested and decided that it was important that we invite him to come and speak tonight. As his background states, he's worked for more than a decade in journalism, including at TVO's The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and I think it was a conversation between Steve Paikin and Eric Morse that actually generated this event, so that's great news. But he's also worked for CBC News, CTV National News, and the Literary Review of Canada. He's also an enthusiastic scout leader. Now, great stuff. Here's what's important in the RCMI. His grandfather, Flight Lieutenant Ronald Lowman, DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, for those who don't know what DFC means, of 47th Squadron Royal Air Force, worked as a journalist at the Toronto Star, and he often covered Canadian military events for over 44 years. And he was a proud member of the RCMI from the 1950s onward. But, just to carry on the family tradition, Harrison's father, Tim, is right here, and he is also a member of the RCMI. So this is a 3-generation event, and isn't that wonderful? Thank you very much for that. Now, here's the bad news. So I have a list of people which is right here. If you're not on the list, you must leave now. Right, nobody's leaving, that's good. So Harris is going to speak for a period of time, and then when he's finished, I will moderate some questions and answers, and we're looking forward to that. And then we'll give him a gift, and then I want everybody to go upstairs to the 3rd floor, to the long bar, and partake, because this event tonight is free. And this is the first time we've done it this way. I'm going to take a little survey after, because I want to find out whether this model works for members and non-members. You're not paying to come to this event tonight, but the RCMI needs your revenue, it needs your assistance. So if you can stick around for a beer or two, which will only cost you $70 or $80, we'll be fine, okay? Harrison, are you good to go?
Yes, yeah.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you right now. Come on.
Also, I don't know if it's good to be called an expert these days. Is that like a compliment, Elamine? What do you think? No? Yeah. Okay, so when they said to me, Harrison, you should speak for 30 minutes, and I said, oh my gosh, 30 minutes? Like, I like to talk and hear my own voice, but 30 minutes is a lot. It's like a Seinfeld episode. And then I thought, okay, so is this kind of going to be like a Seinfeld episode, but like more serious? Some jokes, but a little bit more serious. And I still have to figure out what the name of this room is.
Meeting room 3.
Wow. So auto room medals, and then we get meeting room 3. What was the 1984 room called where he was tortured?
Room 101.
101. Okay. Okay. On August 15th, 2021, Taliban fighters stunned the world, streaming into Kabul, Afghanistan like a swarm of locusts. They spread through the city on dusty pickup trucks, stormed into government buildings past streets that NATO forces had lost their lives over. They occupied the capital at lightning speed, and barely a shot was fired. In mere hours, Kabul was draped in their black flags. They had returned to power after 20 years of being banished. An Afghan humanitarian who worked in a women's health care in southern Afghanistan texted me from inside a bunker. I asked if she was okay at the time. She told me, I'm safe. Afghans are not. It's insane. An Afghan journalist who grew up in Kabul and had been covering the conflict for 20 years was gathering his family to flee. He told me he had just witnessed the massacre of his dreams. He said him and his family ran for their lives. Western ambassadors had been preparing for this day, but they could not have imagined how fast it would come. They were scrambling. The British ambassador, whose name is Sir Laurie Bristow, sounded like he was going to go down with the ship. We'll put everything we can on this for the next few days, he said. We'll try to get everyone out who needs to get out, get them to safety as soon as we can. He would go on to evacuate thousands. The Americans stayed as well, as did the French. France sent commandos to gather French nationals and Afghan families and get these families to military planes. The Ukrainians, who were on the cusp of being invaded, chartered a bus which drove through open firefights to get their people out, along with Afghans who had helped Canada get them out of harm's way. Where was Canada, you might ask? Gone, missing in action. We reportedly were one of the first, if not the first, major embassy to evacuate. Within no time, long-bearded guerrilla fighters were walking through our embassy, traipsing through the abandoned building, past piles of empty wine bottles, and a painting of an Afghan girl learning to read beneath a red maple leaf. It was a bad look for a supposed feminist foreign policy. Where was the Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, Mr. Reid Sears? He had apparently boarded a half-empty RCAF plane and taken off to safety, one of only 2 Canadian military aircraft to flee the city. If he had looked down as he left Afghan airspace, he may have been able to make out the more than 1,000 Canadian citizens and interpreters who had helped our armed forces during our 13-year mission. We all saw on TV, it was 2 planes after ours that people were hanging off the airplane when people fell off of it, he said later on. So it was quite close for us. For us, Mr. Sears, thousands of terrified people were stranded, and what notice did our citizens and allies get who had been left behind? It turns out they initially received text messages from Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. They were instructed in English only to proceed with no escorts because our soldiers, military advisors, and diplomats were gone. Sneak past Taliban fighters through a churning, muddy, and bloody sea of desperate civilians onto the Kabul airport. They were later told that if they made it to the airport, they should raise their hands and yell Canada and hopefully wear something red. They would hope a soldier would hear them. In coming weeks, we would soon realize that it was not up to our government to evacuate these people and interpreters. It was up to volunteer veterans who had gone to the country to serve. This, in my opinion, was a complete abdication of duty. We betrayed these people, and we should be ashamed. The Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan would be quietly reassigned to a posting in Argentina following a stress break. But his staff, and this is one of the most galling parts, would be honored with a ceremony and a $10,000 plaque that currently sits outside Global Affairs Canada. It commemorates what the federal government has described as an amazing evacuation of Afghanistan, and astonishingly reads, "This pays tribute to all the Government of Canada employees who contributed to this heroic effort." Sear's LinkedIn profile currently reads that he has skills when it comes to managing during crises. In Kiev, Ukraine, on February 12, 2022, 12 whole days before Russian troops fired a shot, Canada would again be one of the first to leave. We hold the title of being the only G7 country to immediately pull our diplomatic staff out of Kiev at this time. It then took almost 90 days for us to reopen our embassy. In Israel this past October, as Hamas terrorists burst into Israeli kibbutzim, slaughtering men, women, and children, Canadian citizens on the ground who attempted to contact our embassy there were met by a voicemail advising them that the embassy was closed for the long Thanksgiving weekend. They were directed to an emergency hotline in Ottawa. Overall, it seems to me that when the going gets tough, Canada gets going. All of these are examples of symptoms of a disease this country has been suffering from for years. Believe me, we are sick and we are in desperate need of a cure. It's now 2024, and we are still relying on a Pearsonian reputation that we built in the 1960s. Can you guess how many Canadians we currently have taking part in UN peacekeeping operations right now? The present government, who in 2015 insisted that we were back on the world stage, would have you believe there are thousands of Canadian Blue Berets stationed across the globe. The real answer is 57 people. In 1992, the number was 3,285. This year, our reputation is running on fumes, and the world it was built on no longer exists. No matter how much we pretend it still exists, it does not exist. Free riders, not pulling its weight, risk-averse, unreliable, not fit for purpose. These are the words we increasingly see next to our country's name, whispered in the corners of international conferences worldwide. Not only that, but you now hear words like preachy, act like they are morally superior. Former Liberal Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister John Manley recently had this to say: "We seem to have decided that we would rather carry a soapbox with us and get up on it and tell people how they need to do things differently, rather than finding ways to insinuate ourselves into these many complex and difficult situations." You've all heard the expression, walk softly and carry a big stick. But a Canadian academic by the name of Dennis Stairs says today, Canada foreign policy is more akin to speaking loudly and carrying a bent twig. Before he passed, Matthew Fisher, someone who appeared on the agenda regularly as Canada's longest serving foreign affairs correspondent, used to tell me, "There is no country in the world that does less and says more than Canada." And it begs the question, on the world stage, are we a serious nation or are we not? In an interview with the Toronto Star a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Trudeau stressed that one of his biggest priorities was standing up to the international rules-based order. A few weeks later, Donald Trump, possibly the next US president again, spouted off at a rally quoting an unnamed world leader who asked him about NATO spending and collective defense. Well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us, Trump? What did Trump say his response to this was, to this world leader? You don't pay, you're a delinquent. No, I won't protect you. In fact, I would encourage them, Russia, to do whatever the hell they want. You gotta pay. Today, the international rules-based order that sustained us for 75 years is on life support. It is hanging on a thread, and it cannot be wished back into existence. The foundations of our world are being shaken to their core, admitted UK Defense Secretary Grant Shapps at the beginning of this year. In its place, we see authoritarian leaders emerging and multilateral institutions like the UN, the WTO, where our soft voice used to be amplified, becoming increasingly irrelevant. As Ben Rousewell, a convener at the Network for Democratic Solidarity and a former Canadian ambassador recently told me, these organizations are increasingly becoming paper exercises. Meanwhile, strong, illiberal, authoritarian leaders of powerful countries, Russia, China, Iran, have formed old boys clubs of bullies on a parallel plane outside the halls of multilateral institutions, and they don't care about the rules. Putin started a European war. China's building artificial islands that are in the contested South China Seas. He's eyeing Taiwan. Iran is fomenting unrest across the Middle East. It's a knife fight, says Rousewell. The world is suddenly becoming stranger, more dangerous, more complicated, and we're beginning to feel those reverberations here in Canada to a greater extent, says David Mulrooney, our former ambassador to China. But the government has simply not responded to that. Rousewell, and I was surprised by this quote, adds the Prime Minister has shown utter incompetence as a foreign policy leader specifically. It has now come to the point where even our traditional allies are turning their backs on us. The world no longer immediately says, we want more Canada. When asked what he thought our biggest national security risk was, former Chief of Defense Staff Rick Hillier said, our irrelevance. The fact that no one even bothers to phone us if they're talking about doing something as a group of Five Eyes or something of that nature. AUKUS, an alliance of US, Britain, and Australia, is a new security pact focused on sharing military technology and intelligence, and hooking up Australia and American and British nuclear submarine technology. But Canada's federal government is not interested in nuclear submarines. Instead, we have 4 diesel-electric subs that break down constantly and were purchased in 1998. And so we're not invited to that party either. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity counts India, Japan, South Korea, and Australia among its 14 members. We're not there either. The Quad, the quadrilateral, the most ridiculous name, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue consisting of the US, India, Japan, and Australia, that's been described to me by experts as the emerging forum for liberal democracies to take collective decisions around the Indo-Pacific. It's also seen as a way to offset China's power in the region. Canada has no seat at that table either. Our diplomacy, as Rousewell describes it to me, is now in retreat. Withdrawal from the world has become a top priority of our government. Mulrooney says there's a great deal of frustration amongst young Canadian diplomats getting into the field because of a lot of it simply seems to be retweeting government press releases. They don't have a voice. The Senate recently released a report on Canada's Foreign Service. Believe it or not, it's the first time in 40 years that this has been done. There is worry that we're not developing leaders anymore, and the Foreign Service staff, they're not being encouraged to disagree with one another to come to conclusions. Instead, it's become a series of, as one person described it to me, kumbaya moments. When Prime Minister Trudeau won the 2015 election, ending years of conservative rule, conservatives who, Anthony will tell you here, we're stepping away from some of these multilateral institutions where public servants were optimistic that more would be invested in the Foreign Service. They swarmed and cheered Trudeau. They hugged him and took selfies. And the CBC headline, I actually read, Justin Trudeau joyfully mobbed by federal civil servants at Global Affairs. Things seem to have changed since then, though. Mulrooney says that these Foreign Service workers have been thrown under the bus on every occasion. The bus tracks are going forward and in reverse all over these guys, he says. Diplomatic staff spent 2023 running from crisis to crisis, insisted Pamela Eastfeld, president of the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers. She adds that staff spent most of their time on administration, keeping the doors to the offices open, that they really don't have time anymore to reach out, make foreign contacts, or understand what's going on or advocate for Canadian interests. Our diplomats are Canada's eyes and ears to the world, and according to some, they're increasingly going blind and deaf. Our journalists are also supposed to be our eyes and ears to the world. But when it comes to coverage overseas, monumental budget cuts and retaliatory regimes are limiting our coverage, turning us blind and deaf as well. In the 1960s, our media had foreign bureaus dotting the globe: Beijing, London, Washington, Berlin, Paris, Brasilia, Sydney, Rome, Cape Town. Last year, CTV shut down the doors of its London and Los Angeles bureaus, firing all the staff there. It now has one person in Washington covering the US. It left places like China and Israel a long, long time ago. The Toronto Star recently closed its last foreign bureau in the US. It now has one writer covering international affairs in Europe. Global News, now aptly named, not aptly named, one might argue, has two people in Washington, two journalists in London. The Canadian Press has one foreign correspondent. The National Post, Toronto Sun, all of Post Media, no foreign bureaus. The Globe and Mail, 3 people covering all of Europe, 1 person covering the US, 1 journalist covering the continent of Africa, 1 in all of China, and 2 international correspondents. I reached out to all these people, my friends and fellow colleagues, to get the latest numbers on these, and it was like the Monty Python scene, the Bring Out Your Dead. It was brutal. In 2012, CBC shuttered its bureaus in Africa and South America. It has 45 employees working out of New York, Washington, London, Mumbai, Paris, and Taiwan. They set the gold standard. There also appears to be no permanent Canadian journalists covering all of the Middle East. Fewer than 60 Canadians, by my count, appear to now be covering the world beyond our borders. Are we okay with that number? In 2022, CBC shut down its Beijing bureau after more than 40 years. Journalists were denied visas by an authoritarian government. There's now no Canadian journalists living and working in the superpower that is mainland China. They were also kicked out of Russia after 44 years, leaving their office in Moscow. There are now no known Canadian correspondents covering Russia from Russia, helping us to understand a superpower that just initiated the most severe attack on a European country since the Second World War. If Canada was engaged in another war now, we wouldn't have foreign correspondents to cover it. There would be no budget for them to be full-time, to pay for insurance and training that would allow them to cover this safely. Canadian war correspondents, I mentioned Matthew Fisher, they ceased to exist. When Western forces fled Afghanistan, as I described a few minutes ago, there were no Canadian journalists on the ground to cover our exit. This after giving that country 13 years and 160 Canadian lives. What are the effects on the media side of this? Our country, ironically, is surrounded by 3 oceans that keep us largely safe from threats. But it's making us less curious. Young journalists are denied the experiences of seeing and reporting on the world, and instead we get our foreign news from shared foreign news wires that merely repeat surface-level analysis. Weirdly, in the age of the metaverse and Zoom, we become less interconnected, and other countries understandably get the impression that we don't care about them. On top of this, the office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs has been cheapened. Minister Melanie Joly is now the 5th Foreign Affairs Minister appointed in 6 years. Her predecessor served for just over 9 months. Not just the Liberals, 2 of the Foreign Affairs Ministers in the previous Conservative government lasted around 9 months. Another Harper Foreign Affairs Minister lasted more than a year, just over a year and a half. This used to be the 3rd most important job in federal politics, behind the PM and the Minister of Finance. At the time of Joly's appointment, a lot of surprise was expressed given her lack of experience on the world stage, having only held portfolios in tourism, official languages, and economic development. All this high turnover means that there's a lack of consistency. Politicians don't have the time to learn their roles and the complexity of the world that confronts us. It also means that allies come over to our tables at international conferences and are met by complete strangers. When our politicians do go abroad, rather than thinking about advocating for their interests of their country as a whole, they are increasingly playing to diaspora crowds back home. Canadian politicians are now using trips abroad to pander to the votes of Canadian immigrants back home. And we apparently do this more than other countries. Trips to China, to India have become chances to perform. Mulrooney says Canadian politicians see foreign policy now as an exotic stage on which to conduct Canadian politics. It's also playing out domestically on Canadian streets. Foreign affairs are now domestic affairs. Many immigrants come to Canada to find better lives, hoping to leave the less desirable aspects of their home country behind them. But it often follows them here, as we've seen over the last few years. A Sikh separatist leader is murdered on Canadian soil by what security agencies allege were agents of the government of India. An alleged hit squad sent by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia plans to murder a former Saudi intelligence official, also on Canadian soil. The Eritrean consul threatens and demands money from Eritrean Canadians. Or Chinese Communist Party police stations operate in this city where they intimidate and punish Chinese Canadians. Still, other immigrants bring their political baggage with them. Look no further than the months of intense protests we've seen around the Israel-Hamas war. Gets to be concerning. As Stephen Marsh said in the Globe a few weeks ago, the foundation of Canadian multiculturalism rests on a basic piece of common sense. Leave your shoes at the door. Importing the world's geopolitical nightmares into our country will end multiculturalism. Our armed forces are also neglected, ill-equipped, and fed up. We are an irrelevant military force, summarized retired Lieutenant General Mike Day, a former Canadian Special Forces commander and chief strategic planner for the Canadian Armed Forces. Other former high-ranking members of the forces are furiously writing op-eds in our papers, claiming our military is on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, almost without precedent, we're seeing soldiers who are actively serving, coming out and publicly taking risks by voicing their concerns about the state of our military. Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, published a video recently on YouTube where he came out and explained the dire state of our Navy. He said his team faces some very serious challenges that could mean they fail to meet commitments. He bemoaned the fact that one of the Canadian Navy's new offshore patrol vessels can only be deployed at a time because of major staff shortages. Vice Admiral Bob Astroloni, commander of the Canadian Joint Operations Command, also expressed publicly how soldiers are increasingly being relied on to respond to Canadian natural disasters which are not in their job descriptions. The current defense minister is working off a mandate letter penned 3 years ago. There was supposed to be what's referred to as a defense update. That's where you name the military's long-term goals and the equipment needed. It's supposed to be delivered in the fall of 2022. But it is AWOL. Still hasn't happened. We haven't had an update since 2017. Consider for a moment how much the world around us has changed since 2017. We're arming men and women who are sending into harm's way with obsolete equipment. Their equipment's been relegated to a sort of broken equipment parked by the fence, says former Chief of Defense Staff Rick Hillier. Our fighting ships are on limitations to the speed at which they can sail or the waves that they can sail in. And so he says, I feel sorry for the men and women who are serving there right now. Last year, I reported on some of our most egregious military equipment mishaps, and here's a selection of what I found. Our soldiers have been using World War II era Browning 9mm handguns as their standard issue sidearm. We've been trying to replace them for more than a decade now. We only retired the 114-year-old Lee Enfield rifle from frontline service a few years ago. We were the last national military in the world to do so. There was a version of this rifle used in the Boer War, which was the late 1800s. Canada's Victoria-class submarines were already secondhand when we purchased them in the 1990s. They've been breaking down and barely making it to sea ever since, and we apparently need to use them until the 2030s. Then there's the notorious Sea King helicopters, which were flying for 55 years before they were replaced. The process of replacing our ancient fleet of CF-18 fighter aircraft took 12 years, over a decade. They're approaching 40 years old now, and the interesting fact here is that grandfathers of the people currently flying our fighter jets could have flown the same planes. My own grandfather, a journalist covering the forces, was mentioned earlier, he flew in one of the first ones delivered to Canada. We are now going to re-equip these squadrons and fly the F-35 whenever that happens. Now, others disagree with all this. There's not just acceptance. They assure me that our military is not on the verge of collapse. that we should take the advice of retired generals calling for billions more in spending with a big grain of salt. They say that these people are often working as consultants for defense companies. The critics will also tell you that for much more, if we were to spend much more on defense, it will come at the expense of social services, and that a lot of this is just fear-mongering. I spoke to Peggy Mason, who's president of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs, former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the UN, and she told me that it's a bottomless pit. There's never enough money for the defense establishment. And yet D&D cannot even spend all the money it gets now, to the tune of $1 to $2 billion a year. The Department of National Defense will always say it needs more money, and there's a lot of hype that accompanies that, says veteran Ottawa Citizen defense reporter David Puglisi. When you look at NATO, our current NATO contributions sit at about 1.38% of our GDP. You saw this in the news this week. It's a far cry from the 2% promise that we made. Ignoring that, Prime Minister Trudeau reportedly privately told NATO officials Canada would never hit our spending target. We would actually need to spend 30 to 40% more to reach that 2% commitment, and then figure out a way for the Defense Department to actually absorb and allocate what would be a whopping $20 billion. We currently rank 25th out of 30 NATO members when it comes to defense spending, but we're around the 6th largest spender in terms of absolute dollars. All this, and the Defense Department has apparently been told to cut $1 billion in funding by 2026. Now, Poilievre will tell you that if he wins office, his government will work towards increasing military spending to 2% of GDP. He'll tell you he'll do it by slashing back office bureaucracy, stopping corruption in procurement, and cutting foreign aid. But our contributions to official development assistance, aid to developing countries, has collapsed already under the current government, says Roswell. Under this government, it's reached historically low levels, and no government is immune from ballooning procurement costs. If all this were not enough, there are critical recruitment and retention issues. The armed forces are currently staring down a shortage of 16,000 troops. Among those we need most urgently are medical officers, naval operators, aviation specialists, communication experts, and technical tradespeople. We've all heard as well of the raft of sexual misconduct scandals, some involving more than a dozen of Canada's top military brass. And I found this, couldn't believe it. A December 2023 report from Statistics Canada suggests the problem is only getting worse. In 2018, 1.6% of CAF personnel said they were sexually assaulted by another service member. Today, it's 3.5%. Not to mention struggles diversifying the force, which is overwhelmingly, of course, white and male. 71% of our military are white males. For comparison, the civilian workforce is about 39%. 16% of CAF members are female. That number is supposed to be 25% by 2026, but one must wonder if this is realistic and whether there's a natural ceiling to that number. The military is facing real internal threats here that run the risk of becoming existential. A professional Canadian military cannot function if its leaders and service members are complicit in preying on the few female soldiers in its ranks. A professional Canadian military cannot sustain itself if it can't attract people who are not white when the Canadian population is increasingly not white. So we have to think of solutions. Here's where things get a bit dicey. The current government thinks much of the solutions involve deploying an arsenal of identity politics weaponry. Today's soldiers aren't just fighting in an actual war, they're also fighting in the culture war. The Canadian Military Journal, the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the Canadian Armed Forces, tasked with improving the development of soldiers, recently ran an issue highlighting what it described as feminist, intersectional, trauma-informed approach to reimagining and transforming CAF culture.
What?
The general thrust was that the military is inherently racist, colonialist, patriarchal, oppressive, and needed to be torn down and rebuilt from its ashes. Racism in Canada is not a glitch, say the writers. It is the system. Colonialism and intersecting systems such as patriarchy, heteronormativity, yes, I said that word really fast, I impressed myself there, ableism constitute the root causes of inequality within Canada, wrote one contributor. Another called out the military's violent aggression, institutional unity, and hierarchy. So we just go through these here. Violence, a formal collective camaraderie, ranks. I find myself asking, this is quite literally what the military is. This is quite literally the point of all armies since we assembled as groups of cavemen and began throwing rocks at one another. Is the ultimate purpose of soldiers not to practice violence and aggression in defense of their country and, when necessary, end the lives of other people? An anonymous senior member of the forces recently told the National Post that Trudeau's government's intense focus on fulfilling social policy objectives has come at the expense of battle readiness. When she entered the role, the previous Minister of Defense, Anita Anand, said her top priority was to make sure everyone in the forces feels safe and protected. And it raises an important question. Should the military's top priority be to create soldiers who feel safe and protected? Or rather, is the paramount priority to create a highly trained military that is battle ready, ready to be put in harm's way? Or can both top objectives be achieved simultaneously? The new inclusive approach has meant the introduction of anti-racism toolkits, which have been distributed among soldiers, gender-neutral uniforms, relaxing bans on face tattoos, lengthy beards, long hair, and bright hair dye. But I can assure you that these changes did not result in a stampede to recruitment centers of hordes of people with goatees and spider face tattoos. Pause for a moment and put yourself in the shoes of an 18-year-old Canadian young man who's considering enlisting. Since he was 8, he's been told by his government that his country is a settler colonial state, guilty of countless historical misdeeds, and complicit in various forms of genocide. He's been told by the Department of Defense that the military is a bastion of white supremacy and male supremacy. Ask yourself if this would make you want to join that military and potentially sacrifice your life for that country. There's of course a danger in being too gloom and doom. A cottage industry has formed over the last few weeks that includes many on the right who insist this country is completely broken and hopeless on the world stage. Where there is truth in this, we must not get carried away or become completely pessimistic and lose hope for the future. It's easy to criticize and break things. It's hard to fix them. Praise where praise is due. The other day I was speaking to Roland Paris, a professor of international affairs at the University of Ottawa. In 2015, he was in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office helping to craft this country's approach to foreign affairs. He calls this band of complainers the We Suck Club. Membership is growing, and my membership card might be headed my way soon. Roland says the Trudeau government successfully managed the most important part of our foreign policy, the US. More specifically, it stick-handled files through the tumultuous Trump years for 4 years. He calls it their most important foreign affairs policy accomplishment. And we may have to do it all again soon. Roland says on a per capita basis, we should be proud of our support for Ukraine. On the military front, he praises the Canadian Armed Forces training in Latvia, and he points to us helping form the initial Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. He says we did good work with 75 countries against arbitrarily detaining foreign nationals and using them as bargaining chips. Think of the two Michaels. He says that while our Indo-Pacific strategy was late, it hits the right notes on paper at least. And how much can we blame a prime minister and his government for what have been sea changes in the foreign affairs landscape? For instance, a weakening, distracted, and preoccupied America has exposed Canada to challenges. Any Canadian prime minister would have difficulty managing foreign policy under the last several years, Roland concludes. Nevertheless, even he admits that this government has not expanded Canada's foreign policy and defense capabilities to the level it absolutely needed to deal with these critical problems. When it comes to solutions, and I'm almost done, don't worry, with these critical problems, former Canadian diplomat Ben Roswell tells me the answer is in fact more politics. I know, when have you ever heard someone say the answer is more politics? It's counterintuitive. But he says up until now, Canadian political parties have not seen the advantage in differentiating themselves on foreign policy issues. Politicizing foreign affairs policy would mean the public at least would have a say in what our country does. Better that than leaving foreign policy to the mandarins in Ottawa, he says. There's already enough money being spent for the small coterie of elites in Ottawa to go off and run our foreign policy on their own and not inform the rest of us. These days are over, he says. Canadians need to be fully involved in the foreign policy debate. Do we want to continue underfunding the military and aid, or do we want to actually care about having an influence on the world stage? David Mulroney looks at things in a lot of darker of a way. It will take a crisis in Canada's relationship with the world to make us focus on serious foreign policy of the kind we're capable of and used to be very good at. What's something we used to be good at, you might ask? Australia's greatest fear is that Canada re-engages in Asia because we're better at it than them, says Mulrooney. Even though the Australians are closer geographically, Canadians are good at convening. They're good at bringing people together, finding ideas that work for other people. We have that talent with us. 85 years ago, World War II began. A year in, during the summer of 1940s, as Nazis descended on France's capital, Canada's Paris embassy remained open to assist those in need. Our ambassador, Mr. Vanier, allegedly left only when the French president did. He did so only after helping to orchestrate the escape of Canadians, along with many refugee children. Let's get back to a place where when the going gets tough, Canada does not get going. Thank you.
Well, on that positive note, we're open for questions. So let's start at the very back with Dr. Craig Stone.
So I want to provide some context and challenge a couple of things that have been said. So I'm an academic, spent 30 years in the Army. My discipline is defense economics. I've written about the 2% of GDP issue. But context is really important. So when he talked about, we used to have 3,000 people wearing blue berets. Yeah, we used to. And then 2,500 of those went and took off those blue berets and were doing peace support operations. They were still UN mandated missions. You just weren't wearing a blue beret in the 90s because peacekeeping doesn't really exist very much anywhere in the world anymore. So contextually, and I don't disagree, like we have hardly anyone doing any of that stuff right now. So that part of what was said is true, but context is important. The landfill rifle issue and the pistol issue. So like I carried a pistol on my waist the whole time that I was in the Army, and I never used it. I carried a submachine gun. Infantryers carry rifles, not pistols. And I could throw my pistol more accurately than I could shoot it. So the fact that it's 100 years old, from an Army soldier perspective, is really irrelevant. Because if the person is that close to you, you've already failed in your mission. So just, yeah, it's old, but context is important. The CMJ Journal article. CMJ has a new editor. CMJ for decades had a structure of a history article, a technology article, a leadership article, and some other stuff. The new editor has done 3 themed issues. One on professional military education. The most recent one, which I can tell you that some of my colleagues wrote a couple of those articles, and like the people in uniform hate some of it, but it's a themed academic issue, and that's what academics do. The hair issue, only because it drives me nuts. As a guy who spent 30 years in the Army, and like my hair is still short, and I still get it cut every 2 weeks. The Dutch tried this, let people have long hair and colored hair, and it did not work for the Dutch. And in a decade, I suspect we'll decide it's really not doing what the CAF wants either, in terms of this attraction of people. But I just ask people to realize that all of this media stuff you hear is from people who have an opinion, and academics have opinions and they write about it and they gather the evidence to support the argument they want to make, not necessarily the arguments that challenge what they want to make. So you have to actually be critical of what academics write and what the media writes, because there's a context to all of this.
Sure. So like, I totally acknowledge the fact that on the peacekeeping side of things, the environment changed, right? Like how does peacekeeping work in 2024? At the same time, I'll say, from what I've heard, and again, I'm speaking to academics, but also former soldiers, would you say there's consensus that our mission in Mali was a good mission? We did our best. We did what we said we were going to do. Like, that's in the not so recent past. Is that fair for us to critique that mission was basically a failure in many ways?
I know the guy who led that mission, and he would tell you it's a success.
And what would you say?
Others who tell you that it was a disaster.
What would you say?
I don't think we achieved what we said we were going to achieve.
Yeah, so I guess that's the most recent example I would put on the peacekeeping side. Yeah.
And that was Canada's back, and that was the least risky mission in Africa that we could do.
So here's stuff that irks me is when most saying you're going to do something and then not doing it is worse than doing nothing at all.
Yeah.
If you dip your toe in the waters and you're going to go into Africa and you say you're going to help people and you don't, and you do a half-assed job and you kind of pretend that it was this incredible thing, or you kind of sweep it under the rug and you hope that people aren't paying too much attention, but you can still put the press release out. That's like, this is embarrassing. For the magazine article, when it comes to universities, you'll see with the student caps that are being put out that they will increasingly face financial difficulties as a result. And I think what you'll see in the next few months is them needing to prove their worth to us. If they're entitled to public funds, and if they're going to put out the stuff we saw in the pages of that official military magazine, and they're going to assert that this is the way forward to solving some of the solutions that I put out, then it needs to withstand scrutiny. I'll look at it further. I would be very interested in seeing the qualitative research that was done in those articles. I would be interested in surveying current and former members, and I would love to see what percentage of them think that these are the solutions to the problems we're facing. And I would love for them to give us a response as to if they think this is a good use of the limited funds that the Canadian military has. If this is what's going to get us to the finish line. And I
don't disagree with any of that, because I think most of the stuff that was in that journal, and I'm 65 years old and I joined the Army when I was 18, I think most of the stuff that was in that journal I don't agree with. That's not the Army I joined. And I would remind folks that when we went to Afghanistan and had soldiers in harm's way, we didn't have any problem recruiting people to go and serve in Afghanistan. We had an overabundance of people joining the infantry to go to Afghanistan. So just contextually.
I just want to add too, I'd be interested in seeing the whole the population of Canada surveyed when it comes to some of these terms, which allege that the Canadian Armed Forces and the country as a whole is a bastion of white supremacy. And yes, Alamy, sorry.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi. Hello, Mr. Lowman. Thank you for your presentation. I've been subject to some version of this for many months of my life.
Alamy is a friend of mine. He's also a CBC host.
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry, I'll project. I guess my question has to do with the retreat from the military, not just in Canada, but across the developed world. And generally speaking, when we talk about the United States and its retreat from its role as a world leader, we're talking about a crumbling international world order. There is no clearer example of that than when you see, President Zelensky ask in front of all of NATO, here we are, we're ready for this, will you have us? And the world says, no, there's too much risk in this. So my question to you is, if you see the United States sort of backing away from its role in international world order, can we be, as a middle power, can we be holier than the Pope on this? Can we, in fact, take the place of the United States? Because if the United States is going to retreat from it, then how could we possibly lead that charge when there is a vacuum globally? Thank you for your presentation.
Well, you guys can correct me because you're more nerdy than I am, but I think in terms of even just sending over equipment to Ukraine, I think the cupboards are bare when it comes to Canada, right? How much when it comes to materiel, which is a word I've always wanted to use. I don't know. Certainly we can't fill the hole that the U.S. leaves.
I meant philosophically as opposed to materially.
Yes.
Because you're
Well-
suggesting that there's a retreat from our global leadership role, and I'm suggesting that vacuum it's there not because of us. It's because the United States has also vacated that role.
Yes, and you saw with was it the Economist cover years ago with Canada's last bastion of liberalism. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Can Canada fit?
Wait, it's less can Canada do this, but how could we possibly do the same thing we used to do when the United States is not doing the thing that it used to do as well?
Mhm.
I'll stop interrupting. Sorry.
I don't know if I have an answer to that.
That's going to be the next meeting.
Yeah, I will say this. The interesting thing: can we do, for example, can we help Ukrainians when you do see and the hub has been critical of this as well. You do see parts of the right, and this is maybe mirroring what's happening in the U.S., increasingly not being as supportive of Ukraine. And what do we do with that if we don't have a united front? Vodek, you have an answer? What do we do with that when we don't have a united front, across all parties when it comes to supporting Ukraine? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Lowman, for this very interesting contribution. I agree with most of it. The thing that you have not sufficiently paid attention to is the fact that Canadians themselves are accountable in the situation being what it is. Canadians have no hunger for a bigger army, stronger army, braver army. Since I arrived at the shore 40 odd years ago, I was struck by how unmartial Canadians are, how they have very little interest in proving themselves in the world as people who are willing to spend both money and spilled blood for the sake of principles that ought to define our ways in the world. And in some ways, Poilievre's unwillingness to side with Ukraine over the fact that 41% of his supporters feel that Canada has already given too much money to Ukraine. So even if the real guys, are so cagey and cowardly, I would say, not understanding how much of nations' brand depends on how it acts in the world, and Canadians don't care very much about that, and governments therefore don't seem very eager to buffer up our foreign policy stances and our military.
I think you said to me once, Vodek, that if you don't have a nuke and you're not willing to, lose lives on the battlefield, then you're not a serious player.
Right.
But so there's actually on the Parliamentary Budget Officer website, there's an app there's like a module you can use and plug numbers into, and you can actually see how much your taxes might potentially go up if we want to meet the 2% number. And I'm wondering how many people would be okay with that, the implications of that in terms of their taxes going up. If Poilievre is wrong and he's not able to find it in bureaucratic issues and cutting aid, etc.
No, Craig, no. Craig, sit down, please.
Yes.
I'll get to you in a minute.
Listen, when I worked at a current affairs show, it was said to us that every time we covered current affairs, the viewership would go down, and it would break my and Vodek's heart and others because we love covering current affairs. Foreign affairs. Well, we're covering current affairs because we're a current affairs show, but yes, we cover foreign affairs. But it would break our hearts because we talk so much about this city being a city of immigrants and caring for all these different cultures. And I thought, but we won't do shows on countries beyond our borders. They should care. I feel like an elitist saying that, but I feel like they should, and it breaks my heart they don't.
Okay, quite quickly, mine dovetails very nicely on this commentary. I was going to ask a little bit about how D&D, how the government can do more to engage Canadians in a security culture. I agree that there's not a sense of urgency amongst Canadians today that the threat levels are in fact rising. As you mentioned, we are bordered by a lot of oceans, which does give us a lot of insulation. However, as we've also seen, the threat levels are in fact rising. depressing. So can the government do more to prepare Canadians and get them on board a little bit more in terms of building up our armed forces, spending more on the military? And you mentioned politics. We need more politics to sort of solve this problem. Well, can we not also engage Canadians in sort of a mass communications way to change the way we think about military strategy, but also our role in foreign affairs?
I feel like, what was the phrase you used? Security culture? It's like the least sexy thing to advertise to a population. Like, I don't know how you do that. Like, come here. Yeah, a lot of it.
Well, we did it. I mean, as a historian, we did it in the 50s.
Yes, but the stakes have to be there, right? You have to feel like, you know, I practice this. I go under my desk in, you know, grade 5 class because we're on the verge of some, you know, nuclear attack.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of it has to do with outreach. I don't know. When do you see recruitment officers? I see them walking around malls and you know, rundown areas, and maybe once at the X. And the sense I get as a civilian is that, you know, being a soldier just involves putting a gun in your hand, as opposed to, you know, there are other jobs there. Like, they need coders, they need people who can be behind computers and do work. Sadly, you know, when you compare the salary of someone doing that to someone doing a similar job in Silicon Valley, it just doesn't stack up. But I would argue that at the same time, you know, you should maybe devote a few years, you should feel the need to serve your country. Maybe you, similar to getting into politics, are willing to take a salary cut because you want to put your skills towards protecting Canada. See, half the stuff I say sounds archaic, but in this room, I get more head nods than I would mostly. How's it going?
Harrison.
Yeah.
Tom Matthews. I play rugby with Harrison, so good to see
You
you.
too.
Tie for once. There's an argument that the Prime Minister's office is in charge of all the important foreign relationships, and the foreign minister is kind of relegated to, you know, secondary, tertiary relationships. Any ideas on how, you know, that cabinet position can get back the prestige and influence it once had, and also in restoring the confidence, the importance of our foreign service? Because reading back into the 40s, 50s, we had some very serious diplomats. You know, I can't name anyone, you know, with that type of prestige or influence in the civil service anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I read the initial story I gave you, which I just have the Canadian Afghan ambassador story just gets me every time. And I heard that the foreign affairs minister wasn't even aware of his departure. Like, it didn't even pass her desk. I feel like, Anthony, I don't know, I feel like you have a better answer to the question than me. Like, in other countries, some of these people are maybe not household names, but they're known of. I don't know how you change that. The next government that comes in, you know, is going to have a PMO that is just as controlling as the last one, in my opinion. I think that's just the standard that's been set. They are going to review everything, and they're going to be this all-seeing eye. And, you know, how do you sell to them, oh, you should give these politicians more freedom, but that introduces the risk that, you know, they have some sort of scandal that you won't be aware of. I don't know how you sell that to people at the PMO's office. I guess if they're confident enough that this person can do the job, maybe they don't need to check in as much, but I just think, sadly, that's sort of here to stay. That's like the benchmark now.
Craig, at the back, please. Craig?
All I wanted to make is understand what the GDP figure means. And I'm an economist. Like, it is got no measure whatsoever to military capability. It is a measure of how much burden the government is putting on its citizens to pay for defense. That's it. And so, in the context of NATO, Canadians are nowhere near as burdened as other NATO nations for defense. That's exactly what that figure means. Is how much of a burden you're putting on your citizens to pay for defense.
But it's also a promise, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
We promised we would work towards that. But understand what the figure means. It's how much of a burden you're putting on your citizens. It has nothing to do with military capability.
Please, yeah.
Sandra, I'm a former colleague of Harrison's. But as a citizen, I think one of the ways you maybe sell it to the electorate is that you've got to understand, like when I hear about risks at our shores, most Canadians don't see any risks at their shores. They may see a risk in front of their computer terminal, right? And but people have to have a broader sense of what defense spending means, because obviously it's always going to be the traditional sense of defense spending that we have to contribute to NATO to make sure that we are protected everywhere and around the world. But increasingly, we have to understand that defense spending is a lot more complex than it was 50 years ago, and that yes, we need to sell the public on the fact that cybersecurity is just as important, and funnel more young people to serve in those areas as well. I mean, I would think that that would be a more sellable point.
I feel like there's some people that maybe won't start to get concerned about this stuff until they're like, they're in a country, maybe here or somewhere else, and they see like sandbags being stacked up on their way to work, and then it sort of hits you.
But Canadians can't imagine that because we've never had that kind of scenario on our shores, right? For the most part.
Mm-hmm. And I would say even now, like, it's amazing how we can normalize things. Like a couple of years into the Ukraine war, it's kind of like, oh, that thing in Ukraine, that's like been ongoing. That's just like a constant in our lives. We're not like realizing how crazy it is for there to be a ground invasion in Europe, first time since the Second World War on this sort of scale. It's just like, the sun comes up, Ukraine's being attacked, and people are dying in the thousands every week. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. First from this gentleman, then that gentleman, and then the gentleman right there. So you go first, please.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm Harrison's best friend.
Yeah, all of these people seem like plants.
You're done.
Everyone here doesn't know.
It's a quick question. Do you think we should have 2-year mandatory military service for young folk? And if no, should it be the Boy Scouts?
Okay, so I'm a boy. Know that. Okay, that's right. You got to put in the bio, and then you got to. I will say that in Israel, having interacted with people who had mandatory military service, I met some of the most mature 20-year-olds I've ever met in my life, and they had pistols on their belts, and I was like, "What? You're 20 years old, and can I trust you with it?" But after 5 minutes of conversation, I felt that they were, highly intelligent, far more mature than any 20-year-old I'd met in Canada, and I was sort of very impressed. And I assume that came with their military service.
Sir?
Yes, I would like to throw in another grenade into this conversation, and that's multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a real obstacle in Canada forming a coherent sense of itself in the world. And we're seeing it right now, given the hostilities in the Middle East and what happens on the streets, Toronto, Montreal, and seeing Liberal government's response to this conflict and how well they are doing, speaking out of both sides of their mouths. This is the condition of our foreign policy that is going to be, will continue to be made in the name of various political interests that parties have with various multicultural communities, and I don't see a coherent foreign policy coming out of this.
Is that a question?
Me asking questions?
I don't know how to.
Perhaps it would behoove the ambassador of Poland over here to just remember that multiculturalism has been a national policy of this country for decades, and many Canadians have served.
Just talk about it.
Right, and so this has not threatened the military capability or the desire for people to serve. Thank you, Woody. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Last question, please. Further questions will occur at the long bar down upstairs.
Whoa.
I was going to pick up on this theme that Joanne was talking about, and you kind of alluded to it, Harrison. And this is, how do you engage people? And I think that's one of the big problems. And I don't know what Canadians are actually engaged in anymore, unless it's a hockey game on a Saturday night. Because no one is talking about what Canada stands for. No one is outlining a vision for Canada. The political leaders are just personally attacking each other. They're talking about, pocketbook issues which are important, but most of them are couched in personal insults. Nobody is speaking about the history of the country. Nobody is talking about the military pedigree that we've had in the country. Civics education is the short end of the stick in the public education system. And so someone needs to stand up for Canada and say, this is what our vision is. This is where I'm going to lead the country. This is what we have behind us for the last 150 plus years. And this is where we're going to go in the forward, in the future. And if you want to join me, then follow me and vote for me, because the country is too great over the last 150 plus years to just be talking about all these picayune things that don't make any difference and build a better country. That's what I think is, I guess I should phrase the question by saying, do you agree with me?
I love how this is like a speech and then like mini speeches afterwards.
Get used to this.
No, I agree with a lot of that. And JD, you know as well as I, like, you feel like an old man kind of saying this stuff, as do I. It's, you know, you hear often Canada needs better foreign policy, but then I'm like, what is the foreign policy? Like, what do we have on offer? Like, you're saying the stuff, but what are the bullet points underneath it? And there's also, this is a phrase I keep hearing repeated, you know, I'm only 32, but when I started at Carleton and was interviewing military affairs experts, they would say, you know, the real thing people aren't talking about is that, you know, we have to have this broad approach, and it's the broad approach versus the niche approach. We need to specialize in one thing in particular. We've been saying this for like 80 years. Like, I'm sick of hearing it. Can we pick a lane, or like, what is that even? None of this is sort of conceptualized. I don't know what any of that means. At the same time, like, there's a tendency, you know, on the populist side of things to wow crowds by saying you have all the solutions. There's all these problems and they're so complex, but they can be solved with this, you know, these few solutions. And then I guess what's required is follow-up questions like, okay, put some meat on the bone, man. When you say, you know, Canada's back or XYZ, like, what are the actual concrete things you're going to do? Increasingly, sadly, another standard that's been set beyond, you know, the growth of the PMO is that headed into elections, we don't see the platforms of parties anymore. They can get away with giving us nothing. So we don't even know what their plan is, and then when they're in power, they kind of, you know, a few things kind of drop out here and there, but there's no overarching plan that you can, you know, that's tangible, that you can hold in your hand and you can say, this is what they plan to do, this is the image they're putting forward, and here is exactly what it consists of. There's just, you know, those complexities, because it's hard to sell, right? You just want catchphrases and things that you can't be questioned on. The less you give out, the less detail you give out, the less critique a politician can face. So they're just going to give you the bare bones, surface level stuff, and they're going to see if they can do the smallest amount to get your vote. That's what I would say.
I don't see that being anything new in the world.
Yeah. But no. When you were younger, Eric, you definitely.
I was never.
There were platforms given you. There was the red book, where you could see this is what these guys are going to do if I choose to vote for them.
They found out none of us read it.
But at least you had it. Damn it. Yeah.
Thank you, Harris.
Thank you. Before I go, wait. Because you got to sell your thing. I get to sell my thing.
All right, go ahead.
You guys should all read The Hub. We're young. We're plucky. We're celebrating our 3rd year anniversary in April. It's saying something given the state of Canadian media that I just described. We don't have any foreign bureaus, obviously, but we are growing. We exist at the intersection between coverage and commentary. We do articles, we do op-eds, a bunch of different podcasts. Some people call us like the thinking conservative intellectual home. We are a reaction to two things: the clownish right that is illiberal and it doesn't operate on facts and figures, and the increasingly illiberal left, which also doesn't seem to operate on facts and figures. I'm staring at Lowman. And we want to exist between them. We're not interested in clickbait or rage farming. We will, to our detriment, not do that. It will mean less views for us, but we want to create a beacon of sanity. We want substance. We want, to the point I just made, we want the jot notes underneath the point being made. We want to spell things out. We want to talk about history and context. And I hope you listeners, we're getting like 200,000 weekly users. Yeah, I'd love to have you flip to our homepage, www.thehub.ca. Thank you very much for your patience and your honesty.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.